Have you heard about this personal and professional podcast?
Coaching in Session
with your host, Michael Rearden.
Perception is one of those terms or words that can have different definitions depending on who's going to be saying what perception is. Because essentially what perception is another person's ideal or feel for what is going on. I don't know if you tuned into the episode, I believe it was like 2 weeks ago or something, where we had someone who talked about perception in a very unique way, where perception to them was a brand. Where if someone is looking at you, they're saying, okay, what is your brand? The idea of that is if we can look at our brand, we can look at how to enhance our brand or brand. We can look at how to enhance our brand. But perception for me is very different because perception is how you view something. For example, growing up, grew up in the ghetto, grew up in the hood, right? I could say my perception was my life will always be ghetto. I would always be growing up in the hood. And this is my life, right? Well, it's not anymore, right? They say you can take the man out the ghetto, but you can't take the ghetto out of the man. But I do things very differently here in this house. My father, I remember sometimes things would get broken. And he would just take some duct tape and he would just tape up the door, or he would tape up a window. And it was, one way to do things. And it's just interesting because if we have a draft in my house or something, right? Like there's something wrong with my house, I'll get all new windows. I will fix the root cause versus just kind of putting a Band-Aid on things. And maybe that's the ghetto approach. But the perception aspect is I can say, you know what? Perception is that I will always be in this situation. Many people are defined by them circumstances of what perception is for them. And so they learn their behaviors from their parents or from their peers or from their teachers or from whoever. Essentially, it can even be TV, sitcoms, etc. They say, this is what I need to be doing. So the perception is a idea that can be the good, the bad, or the ugly. And we're going to be looking at all of those different ideas today because perception can be broken down into all of these factors. I think back at the story, and I talked about the story quite a bit. Probably said it maybe like 10 times in the podcast, and I have quite a bit of episodes. So in perspective, I guess it's not that much, but the idea of perception is so powerful because it can lead to good and it can lead to bad. And I think about the story, as I was saying, the story of the two boys growing up with a father who was alcoholic. And the father was just a regular blue collar worker. And he would come home, he would berate his wife and beat his wife and drink and stuff like that. And guess what? The boys would see. The boys said, I guess this is what a man does. This is what it means to be a father. I have to hit my kids. I have to yell at my kids and yell at my family. I have to be stressed out because of work, etc. Sure enough, one of those boys did exactly what their father has done. Get a job that he doesn't love or, that will pay the bills and make ends meet, right? But it was always never enough. And then he would come home and he would drink and he would yell at his wife and he would yell at his kids. And, down the road a little bit, there was a study, right? There was an interviewer who says, I want to, interview these two young boys and see the differences that happen. And so they asked the boy who was following exactly in the father's footsteps, saying, hey, how did you get here? And the boy said, or the man said at the time, he says, I watched my father. And he went on to say that his father was an alcoholic and his father would beat, him and his brother and would beat his mom. And, that's what he thought, a man had to do. But there's a different story with the brother. Now, the brother grew up in the same household with the same mom and the same dad and the same brother. But his perception was different because this young man, when he grew up, he said, I don't want to be like my father. I want to be a loving husband. I want to be, a caring father. And I'm not going to hit my kids. I'm not going to hit my wife. I'm going to find a career that I can love and be successful in. Sure enough, that's what he did. He was extremely successful. The same interviewer asked, and this is why he wanted to interview both boys, was because he wanted to know the difference between success between one man and the next. These two men grew up in the same household. They had the same opportunities, essentially. But one man won and one man didn't. So the interviewer asked, well, how did you get here? Like, how did you win? The successful boy said, I watched my father. It was the same answer that his brother gave. I watched my father. The difference is startling. One man is almost like the angel and the other man is like the devil. Doing the same thing his father did, falling into alcoholism, beating his wife, domestic abuse and child endangerment, if you want to consider that, because it's definitely not a punishment. If the kids are not doing anything right, they're just being kids, maybe being a little bit too loud. He wants perfectly silent in his house because that was, again, that's what the mind is. I had such a rough day. You don't know what is going on in my mind, and you don't know how hard it has to be, like my life is. And so you take it out on people who love you and who are essentially weaker than you. That can be the example, right? But then the other boy was like, no, that's not the example I want to portray. And so he became, a 180 of a man his father was and what his brother fell into, because he said, this is not what I want. So he changed. He changed everything about his circumstance. His perception of his father caused him to be successful, while the other one's perception of the father caused him to be just like the father. Now, I'm not going to say the father was a deadbeat or worthless, because the father could have just left, right? The father didn't have to be in the picture. Some might say, well, it would be better for him not to be in the picture. I can already hear some other people. It'd be better for him not to be in the picture. Well, guess what? One boy did really good and one boy didn't. Why? Perception. And that is what perception is. Perception is the idea to look at what is going on in, around you, whatever, and saying, okay, let me come through a fine-tooth comb, as we talked about in the previous episode of this coaching in session, right? If you haven't listened to it, tune in for maybe the beginning and the end, and you can probably get a good gist of what was being said. I'm talking about being transparent. Perception is not so much about being transparent. It's maybe a factor at some level of perception, but perception is more so of how you're viewing something, because someone can get some bad news, right? And that could be the worst news, right? It's like, that's so bad. You I can't believe it. Oh my God, are you okay? Like, I don't know if you guys ever got like a bad grade or something, like in school. And all your friends are like, oh my God, like that. I'm so sorry you got this bad grade. And you're like, no, it's gonna be okay. I'm good. And they're like, wait, why are you good? Like, you failed. Like, you're gonna have to stay back. He's like, okay, So it's almost like for different folk, it's going to be, a different type of response. Some people are going to respond different to certain stimuli. Certain people are going to say, oh my goodness, like, I can't believe this is happening. And I remember there was a comedian. His name was Ari Spears, I believe. Like Ari Spears. He talked about, black and white families and how, like how they speak to their mothers or something like that. And it's all this comedy, people. So I don't want you to think it's real, but it's comedy and there is some truth to it in a sense. So, for example, he says, there was a black kid at the white kid's house and the kid is yelling at his mom saying, like, don't come in my room. This is my space, etc. And, basically telling his mom he's not going to do stuff, going down the list. Right. And the black boy is like, I will never speak to my mom like that. Right. So a couple of days later, the white boy is at the black boy's house and he's like, playing video games or something. And the mom's like, come down here and take out the trash. And white boy's like, don't let her talk to you like that. You're in your space right now. And she's talking about like his room, right? And then the black boy is like, I don't think you understand. So he's over here saying, I don't want no trouble, basically. And sure enough, the mom comes up and like whoops both their butts. He learned, right? It's difference, in culture. But that culture doesn't necessarily have to be only by color. It's just how that joke was laid out. And you might think that, how is domestic violence a joke? And it's more so of the idea of what it is. Because I've seen families, regardless of colors, have issues with, things that could be going on because a person doesn't know how to regulate their emotions or whatever it be. It all comes down to the person and if they are capable of handling their emotions. Now, perception is not so much an emotional based thing. Perception is what your brain is telling you naturally. So you basically take in all this input from whatever is happening. You take your input from your childhood, you take input from experiences with friends and your own personal stuff. And then you say, you know what, this is my perception on this thing. Now, the perception on the thing could be anything. It could be the perception of a certain career, for example, police. Why do people not like police? The perception of the police, right? They don't like the perception of some police abusing their power or some like police, hurting people that shouldn't be hurt or jailing people, trampling on their rights and privileges, etc. Right? So people have this perception of police that all police are bad or police are not good. But then there's people who say, if I'm in trouble, I need to call the police. You're here to save me. The perception of police being good. And if you go to the hood of Chicago, their perception of police is very different than if you go to, like a suburb in California. Very different in how they perceive the police. The police are going to come protect me. They're going to come save me. The police, on the other hand, could be the police are going to take away my rights. They're going to infringe on me. They're trying to belittle me, etc., right? And you might ask, well, how are we getting here, right? It's the idea of what's being told to us. And it's not only being told to us, it's being repeated by us. Because if we keep repeating something, whether it's the truth or not the truth, it becomes our truth. So the perception of something is something that we instill in our mind, and it happens randomly. I can't even tell you when it's going to happen. It can happen when a kid is 5. It can happen when a kid is 14. All right. It can happen when you're an adult and you're 25 years old and you can say, whoa. Like, I'm just trying, I'm just starting to get this. Because even when I was young, I made a couple of promises to myself. And, it's one of those things where I think back, being a kid and you're naive when you're a kid because you think, the world was gumdrops and rainbows and things are going to be okay all the time. And that's not reality, right? You're going to have hardships. You're going to have struggles. You're going to have failures. You're going to have setbacks. You're going to have things that happen in your life that you don't want to have happened in your life. But you keep on moving forward because you have to. Because if you just remain stagnant, then you're not going to truly live life. So I think back at, like being a kid and I said, okay, I'm not going to get any piercings. I'm not getting any tattoos. What type of car do I want to drive? I don't want to really drive fancy cars and things like that. I don't want to wear my wealth. These were all things that I was giving myself. About my relationships with my kids and, with my wife, seeing from my mom and my dad, all of their issues that they had and fighting and things, even though they're still married, like they made it through. But, growing up, I said, I don't want this, I don't want this for me. I don't want this for my family. And you could ask my wife, do I even raise my voice or I don't swear? Like it serves no purpose. In my relationship now, I don't mind swear. For example, you come to mindset OD, I might use a profanity here and there, but it's not so much of my, my everyday vernacular. It's more so of a spice to add to the show, but it's not something like I'm going crazy and I'm just saying the F-bomb every other word. It's more so of, like a garnish. That's, that really sets off the dish, and the dish is what's going on, the mindset on the aspect of the topic we're talking about. Well, either way. So going on, I looked at all the things growing up saying, I don't want this. I don't want that. I grew up with, in a house and sometimes didn't have power. We didn't have working heat. We didn't have hot water. So it's like, I could say, my life is so rough. You're so tough and everyone should pity me and boo-boo, right? But I say no, like that made me stronger. And it's kind of, an eye-opening experience for me, because now my kid is never going to go through those things again, on my watch at least. But those things made me more resilient. Those things made me stronger. So in a sense, I'm robbing him from the perception of struggle because he's not seeing it. He's not seeing that, you know, the lights are getting cut off and that there's no hot water or that there's no food in the fridge or you have to pick apart the mold from the Wonder Bread. He's not seeing that. He just sees all this fruit on his plate, all this food in the fridge. For him, it's like this is a regular day. He can go to the snack tray. There's hundreds of snacks in there. He can just grab whichever snack he wants. And, for me, we were trying to divvy up, for roll-ups and stuff like that. And we were going to the store with 25 cents we found on the sofa, looking to buy some chips, some salt and vinegar chips, some barbecue chips or whatever, some goldfishes, some annihilators. We would be looking just to buy, some candy and stuff like that. Sometimes we say, you know what? We're not going to buy any candy. We're not going to buy any things because our dog needs food. Our dogs didn't have food sometimes. So we had to go to the store to get, a can of food or something for our dog. It was one of those things, like, it's almost like an eye-opening experience. It was like, how this happen, right? Because it doesn't happen today to me, but it doesn't happen today to me because I saw it happen. And I said, I can prepare for this. And then I see all these young boys, all these young men, sometimes even young women who are growing up in a world that is very different than how we grew up. And my story is not unique. It's very similar to many people who grew up around my time because that was the reality, right? And so now all these kids are growing up in privilege. And so now their perception of things is, well, I'm not going to work like my mom and my dad, and I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to work 8 hours. I'm going to work maybe 4 hours or something along those lines. So their perception is very different today. Now, the only way you can adjust a generational type of mindset or perception is to only give them the examples that you will want to show them. And that's isolation. And you don't necessarily want them to become so isolated that they're outcasted, but you want them to be isolated enough that they can be free thinkers. Critical thinking is huge when it comes to perception, because this allows you to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly of what is your current situation. Because you can say, well, I don't want this. And you can look at the good, if you get it. You could look at the bad, and you could look at the ugly. Now, the bad and the ugly might be very similar, because the bad might be, I'm just going to have this life. It's a very 9-to-5 life, and it's, going to get me what I need. But the ugly truth down the line is that your life is going to be full of regret. It's going to be full with missed opportunities and promises to yourself. And it's going to be a heavy burden. And you might think like, no, it's not so much of looking at life for all the problems. It's about looking at life for the good and the bad and saying, which one do you want? Because if you see someone doing the wrong thing, whether it be drugs or alcohol or gambling or whatever it be, you could say, I don't need this. You can pick and choose. When life is essentially a buffet. You go to the buffet, you have your rice, your pizza, your noodles, your fruits, your salads, your meats, whatever. You have desserts. You have all these foods at the buffet. What if I told you at the buffet, you can only get foods you don't like? Maybe you don't like seafood or something, right? So maybe you only get seafood at the buffet, but yet there's your favorite dishes right there. Why in the world would you not get your favorite foods and you have to get your unfavorite, your least favorite foods at the buffet? The buffet is for you to go in and get what you want, to get what you like. And life can be that buffet. Perception is figurative buffet. The buffet for you to choose what you want. The good, you get to choose. You get to leave the bad and the ugly aside, because you might have tried something, right? Which is perfectly fine in life. You should try things. And you might say, this is not what I want. I tried to do business finance. I, tried to do teaching in a sense. The thing that stuck with me is education and helping people. I want to continually do what I'm currently doing. Down the road, maybe I might change, but it's very rare. Like when you find your purpose and your calling, it's like a light bulb goes off and you're like, this is what I have to do. Now, how you approach it is going to be different for everyone, right? Because maybe you start a podcast. Maybe you start like a keynote speaking company, you get a manager or something along those lines. Maybe you do street interviews. There are so many different avenues that you can take in order to get closer to your dreams and to live a life of fulfillment. You have to have that clear mind in a sense, because if you can't see what needs to be saw or seen, then you're going to have a difficult time getting through. So if you can't look at someone's life and say, you know what, I don't want it. If you can't look at a situation saying, I don't need that. If you can't look at something and say, this doesn't bring any benefit to me, then you need to get very clear on what type of mindset you have. Because if you are just kind of going through and just kind of haphazardly doing things, eventually you're going to be at a point where the wheels are going to fall off and you're going to wonder how you got there. Perception is a tool that can be used to aid you in what's coming in your life. If you can pay attention to that, right, and saying, this is good versus this is my circumstance, you're going to be in a totally different space. So we are not victims, people. I don't want you to feel at any point you are a victim. You might be a culprit to things that have happened to you or that things you have done, but it doesn't mean you have to keep on repeating the process. If you're a person who has fallen into drugs or alcohol, for example, you do not have to stay there. You don't have to say, well, I started, let me finish. Well, when is finishing? When you're dead and gone? No. There's always an opportunity when you have life. And as long as you have life, you get to perceive, you get to say, what do you want? So perception is the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's everything that you can pay attention to, and it's things that you can kind of avoid and say, you know what, this is just what it is. Say la vie, let life be life. It is what it is. But life doesn't have to be just what life is. Because I always say life is essentially what you do with it rather than what it does to you. Because when it comes to life, it can either happen to you or you can happen to life. But for the majority of people that are kind of going through life right now, life is kicking their butt and they're smiling. They're like, well, this is it. This is what it is, versus them fighting back, versus them trying to find alternative solutions, versus them trying to get help and educate themselves, versus them trying to enhance their current situation. It's not an easy thing. I understand that. But it's something that we all have the power to do. We all have the power to think. We all have the power to dream and to believe. And we have the power to change. And perception can lead to change that will completely change your current circumstance and trajectory, or it could be something that either puts you further down from where you thought you would be in life, or it will bring you to exactly the point you thought you can get to. And that is what perception is. It can either make you to the person that you think you are, or it can surprise you to the person that you might have was so challenging to become. Because the difference between someone who wins and someone who loses is a person who has the ambition to keep on going, no matter how difficult, no matter how many challenges or struggles. They understand full and clear that if they want something in life, they have to go out and they have to get it. They have to work for it. They have to be diligent. They create the disciplines and the habits necessary to get them. They don't just fall into what life gives them. They say, I'm going to get the life that's going to be more fulfilling because I see what the bad and the ugly is. Let me look at the good. So I encourage people to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of all situations and circumstances of their life. Perception is going to be what you think about it. You might think that a certain thing is good, right? Having a drink on Friday is a good thing. My dad did it. My mom did it. You might think, going out and partying with your friends is fun because perception, right? Everyone is doing it around me. Why can I? But it's not so much about looking at the things that are always bad and never doing them, but understanding that when you do something, you do it in moderation, because there's nothing wrong with having a drink to celebrate or a cigar to celebrate or to go out with friends and enjoy a night out. Is that habit, if it is done long term, going to bring something good into your life? If the answer is no, hopefully you can use perception to change that.